In pagan antiquity, as in traditional Africa, secular and religious powers were long identified one with the other. As a consequence of Christianity and Islam, they were separated in both places, in the sense that the king no longer performed religious services even when, with Pepin the Short, he once again became sacrosanct. In Arabia, Islam blotted from the mind of the people the very memory of Sabiism, a new religious order, which seemed to emerge from the absolute, blended with the secular and the social organization. The regime of the caliphates rapidly evolved into a theocratic monarchy. No more Sabian king vegetating like a fossil next to the Kaaba. This would obtain in all the Arab kingdoms of Egypt, North Africa, and Spain. In Black Africa, the social order remained practically as it had been before Islamization. But in those places where the people and the king became Islamized, one particular fact appeared. The king no longer exercised a religious function. He was progressively secularized and was seen now only as a simple temporal governor of the country. He was not like those Islamic empire builders, propagators of the faith who established themselves as kings after the conquest of a country, thereby becoming sacred beings uniting the two powers in themselves. He was no longer a preacher. The halo of holiness which surrounded him was progressively to fall onto the shoulders of representatives of the foreign religion, a Muslim clergy of lower class origin, whereas he, the king, more and more symbolized the secular with its implications of coercion and administrative impositions. Under the influence of religion, he would progressively be discredited and considered the very incarnation of Satan. What had created his spiritual force was traditional religion. That, along with the cosmogony, justified his place in society. When those were overcome by the foreign religion, the same fate would befall the institutions to which they had given rise. If this analysis is correct with regard to the king who preserved his religion and ruled over an Islamized people, e.g., the Damels of Cayor, and if it is basically correct in the case of those like Sunni Ali, 1464, whose conversion was merely a formality, it proves inadequate in the case of such prophet kings as the Tukulors of Senegal, El Hajj Omar, Hamadou, etc., whose precursor was the one in Songhai history who might be referred to as His Most Muslim Majesty Askia Muhammad, Prince of Believers. He carried out a coup d'etat by seizing the throne after having defeated the son of Sunni Ali, Abu Bakr Dao, March 3rd, 1493. He instituted the dynasty of the Askias, a term of unclear etymology. He maintained friendly relations with the Muslim clergy and the scholars of Timbuktu. Contrary to Sunni Ali, he governed by using them, asking their advice on all important decisions. By protecting the believers, he won their praise. He can almost be compared to King Clovis, protected by the Roman Church. He made a celebrated pilgrimage to Mecca, accompanied by 1,500 men, 500 cavalry, and 1,000 foot soldiers. He took with him part of the treasure of Sunni Ali, 300,000 gold pieces, which had been stored with the preacher Ammar. Upon his arrival, he gave 100,000 as alms to the cities of Mecca and Medina, and purchased in Medina a mansion which was to serve as a hostel for pilgrims from the Sudan. This mansion must have been large, for the cost of maintenance came to 100,000 gold pieces. Africa thus opened its doors to international life by way of its Muslim kings. In the Holy Land, the Askia met the 14th Abbasid Caliph of Egypt, April 1479 to September 1497, and asked him to appoint him as his representative in the Sudan. It was to a purely spiritual designation. The Caliph accepted, asking the Askia for 3 days to give up his power, mentally speaking, and come back to see him. This was done, and the Askia was solemnly proclaimed by the Caliph his spiritual lieutenant in the Black Countries. He received for this a cap and turban, which made him the delegate of Islam. Was this a way of regaining the moral authority the African kings had been losing since their Islamization? Or was it a profoundly religious act? Whichever, the Askia on his return undertook the first important holy war waged by a black sovereign. The enemy was the Maasai Emperor Naseri, August 1497 to August 1498. The Askia fulfilled all the religious requirements to give his enterprise a sacred character. Askia Muhammad was the monarch whose attitude coincided with completion of the Islamization of the Songhai monarchy. Before him, a king such as Sunni Ali had tried to resist. He had, beyond any doubt, attempted to dam the Muslim flood which, in his eyes, was growing too serious. His harshness toward the clergy of Timbuktu, his manner of practicing Islam, to which he was theoretically converted, must be considered gestures of self-defense. Seen from this perspective, his conduct seems very consistent rather than reflecting a bloodthirsty temperament. The terms in which the Tariq-es-Sudan judges the two monarchs are significant. The author, a fervent Muslim, said of Askia Muhammad, "Thus did God deliver the Muslims from their anguish. He used the new prince to bring to an end their misfortunes and restlessness. Askia Muhammad displayed indeed the greatest zeal for strengthening the Muslim community and improving the lot of its members. On the other hand, he drew a very unfavorable portrait of Sunni Ali. As for this tyrannical master, this infamous villain, he was a man endowed with great force and powerful energy, evil, licentious, unjust, oppressive, bloodthirsty. He caused so many men to perish that God alone knows their number. He persecuted the scholars and the pious by threatening their lives, their honor, or their reputations. Sunni Ali had no lack of excuses. The reason he gave for the massacre of certain scholars of Timbuktu was that they were friends of the Tuaregs, their courtiers, and that he was therefore against them. Thus, as has been mentioned, his conversion was very relative. If we are to believe the Tariq-es-Sudan, which considered him a monarch who made light of religion, he was in the habit of postponing until evening or the following day his 5 obligatory prayers. When he did decide to say them, he merely sat down, made several gestures while naming the different prayers, then said to them, as if they were people, "Now divide all that among you, since you know one another so well." The struggle for political power against Islam by the native clergy seeking to discredit it colored a whole period of African history. It was characterized in Senegal by the exodus of the Marabouts from the city of Koki in the region of Louga Linguère between Dakar and St. Louis toward the peninsula of Cape Verde. This event took place during the reign of the Damo Amari Ngon Nadella, 1791 to 1810. The contempt between the secular and the religious powers was reciprocal. The Marabouts, especially those who were not part of the court, who were not responsible for the mystical defense of the dynasty through the establishment of the Grigris and in other ways, made no mystery of their disdain for everything mortal here on earth. The non-Islamized king was just another kafir, an infidel to them, and since they were often of noble blood and thus imbued with the same pride as the rest of the aristocracy, they often preached civil disobedience, exactly the way St. Paul preached against the cult of the emperor. This was why the Marabouts of Koki were persecuted and forced to go and ally themselves with the Lebus of Dakar. It is interesting to analyze the kind of authority they would set up on the Cape Verde Peninsula after the success of their revolution. The Lebu quote unquote republic. It would not be outside the framework of our main topic, the meaning of royalty, for us to examine the nature of this new power, which has been inaccurately dubbed a republic. To do this, it is indispensable that we trace the genesis of events and return to the village of Koki Diop. We cannot be certain of the origins of the Diop clan, for in the present state of research, it is difficult to trace their migration across Africa by relying on totemic names, for example. There is no doubt, however, that some Diops were to be found in Nubia. Were they fishermen on the Senegal River? Theobolo means fisherman and Tukulor and Piol. And that was the occupation of the Diops in Futa Toro. Considering the idea that Africans like to have of their birth such a modest origin would cause indignation among the Diops of Cayor, who considered the Diops of the river as only an isolated nucleus, reduced to dependency on the Tukulor majority. That being as it may, they arrived in this area already Islamized and founded all the villages in Senegal called Koki. Koki Diop, their homeland near Louga, Koki Kad, Koki Dakar, Koki Goy. The second terms of the last three names designate the species of trees that grew around each village. We shall see later that there are many indications of a link between Koki and Kukia, the latter word referring to an historic city on the Niger downstream from Cayor. In that case, we would have to look toward the east for the origin of the Diops, of whom a few at most would have made a stopover in Futa. In any case, the Diops of Koki were part of the Damascus, Muslim clergy of noble or distinguished origin. The first chief of the Lebu state, Dial Diop, was the son of one of the Marabouts who had emigrated from Koki. He was appointed after the victory despite his foreign origin because he was the one who dared to head the resistance, organize it within the walls of the peninsula, and stand up to the Cayorian Damel, whose maneuvers and state of mind he very well knew, and, unlike the Lebu, was not intimidated by. That makes clear a capital fact that must be definitely stressed in order to clarify the political history of the peninsula. Through a now habitual confusion, the reigning Diop family has become analogized to the general population and thought of as being Lebus, but we have shown that the Diops originated in Koki. The Lebus are a group midway between Wolofs and Serers. They are closer to the latter, whose ethnic names they share: Diagni, Fai, and Engum. They have the same tradition and practice the same libations. They are of the same ethnic type. The homogeneity of the totemic names within an infrequently crossbred human group in Africa allows Lebus and Serers, as well as Wolofs, to be certain that Diop is not a typical Serer Lebu name. Having clarified this point of history, let us go on to the analysis of the form of power established. It was not a republican power, as all the manuals state. It would indeed be hard to imagine a republic in which power passed from father to son within a single family from its origin to the present day. Dial Diop, 1795 to 1815, Matar Diop, his son, 1815 to 1830. Following a dispute over an extradition he refused to agree to, the French intervened and, after lengthy negotiations, managed to have him replaced by his cousin Ilimain Diop, 1830 to 1852. Momar Diop, son of Matar Diop, was his successor, 1852 to 1855. Demba Fall Diop, a descendant of Dial Diop, then acceded to the throne, 1855 to 1861. The French definitively occupied the peninsula during his reign. From then on, they kept a close eye on the succession to the throne, always trying to have it occupied by the Diop most favorable to them. Things continued in this manner until the time of the Sering El Hajj Ibrahima Diop, chief of the Lebus early in this century. When the Marabouts arrived from Koki, the majority of the Lebus were non-Islamized, as are present-day Serers. Not until the beginning of the 20th century was there mass conversion of the populations of the interior, brought about by Ahmadu Bamba and El Hajj Malik Sai. So it was the Diops who Islamized the Lebus and instituted their government, a theocratic monarchy identical in every way to that founded on the Senegal River by the Tukulors in 1776. It is characterized by the existence of a dynasty. As in all monarchies, it is theocratic and Muslim, in that its only code of laws is the Quran. One must not forget that after Islamization, the Qadis of the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai dispensed justice in strict accordance with the laws of the Quran. The Dakar regime thus was no more republican than the governments of those empires. The quote-unquote king had the same character as the sultans of the Arab Orient. He once again succeeded in uniting within himself the temporal and the religious. Monarchic and tribal Africa. Africans thus never experienced a lay republic, even though the regimes were almost everywhere democratic, with a balance of powers. That is why every African is at heart a hidden aristocrat, just as every French bourgeois was before the Revolution. The deeper reflexes of the present-day African are more closely tied to a monarchic regime than to a republican one. Rich or poor, peasant or urbanite, all dream of being a small or great lord rather than a small or great bourgeois. The quality of their gestures and attitudes, their manner of seeing things, whatever their caste, is lordly and aristocratic, in contrast to bourgeois pettiness. There is still one revolution's distance between African and Western consciences in terms of instinctive behavior. These after effects of aristocratism would have been extirpated only if the African, in the course of his history, had become responsible for his own destiny within the framework of a republican regime. Western colonization, even when republican, could not change these facts. That also explains why many blacks adjust perfectly to the manners of the British aristocracy. It is hard to trace to this factor a certain aesthetic approach of the black, although it does seem to be an important trait of the African character. This judgment, contrary to what one might think, is applicable to all of black Africa, to different degrees. In the pre-colonial period, the entire continent was indeed covered by monarchies and empires. No spot where man lived, even in the virgin forest, escaped monarchic authority. But we must recognize that not all peoples living under the same political regime had the same cultural level. Some outlying populations still lived in a scarcely shaken or liberalized clanic organization, whereas the large numbers in the cities were detribalized. A striking example of this is the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. One can indeed contrast on the basis of the remaining documents, Al-Bakri or Khaldoun, the teeming city life of Timbuktu, Gayo, Ghana, Jen, or Mali, which contained only isolated individuals, with the collective life that still held sway in the outlying clans of the gold-bearing regions to the southwest, located on the upper Senegal and even further south, where detribalization was scarcely even beginning. According to Idrissi, blacks who went about totally naked, got married without dowries, and were prolific goat and camel herds with tattooed faces lived to the west of Mali. The other, more highly developed inhabitants of Ghana went slave hunting in this region, which must have covered part of Lower Guinea and the southern part of present-day Senegal. These clans and tribes were in every way comparable to those who lived at the borders of the Roman Empire at the time of its decline and fall, when the Romans were already completely detribalized. This was the political social condition at the time Africa encountered the West at the start of modern times, 16th century. What happened then? The Africans gradually lost their ability to decide their own fates. The local federating authority dissolved, or was at any rate diminished and rendered powerless. Internal evolution was consequently thrown off balance. In the cities where detribalization had already taken place, a return to the past was out of the question. Individuals would continue to be united by social bonds, but where clanic organization still predominated, where social limits were still determined by the territory of the clan or tribe, there would be a sort of turning inward, an evolution in reverse, a re-tribalization reinforced by the new climate of insecurity. Collective life again took precedence over individual life. But, as can well be imagined, such clans were far from being as primitive as one might offhand have thought. They were not without the after effects of the earlier imperial epoch. They were already developed and complex. That is why ethnologists, to their immense surprise, but without exception, always discover in them traditions that do not correspond to this stage of social organization, but are more advanced. They often do not hesitate to attribute this to a phenomenon of degeneration, supposing that these populations living today in so primitive a state had in the past experienced some forgotten great period. We have tried here to demonstrate how they actually researched this point. At any rate, monarchic vestiges being less prominent within clanic life, we can proceed to these partial conclusions, which have a measure of moral and social significance. We can certainly see that there was a monarchic Africa and a tribal Africa. If we try to state the factors favoring evolution in one direction or another, we would have to recognize that African spiritualism, which we have already mentioned, and aristocratism within monarchic Africa were psychological and intellectual factors unfavorable to a socialistic evolution. But the African was an aristocratic collectivist. All of the foregoing underlines what separated his attitude from that of a proletarian collectivist. In the light of his political social life, his solidarity was a lordly one. Despite that, he was not loath to share. The reflexes of accumulation of material wealth remained very slight in him. Consequently, his materialistic habits rather favored a socialistic evolution. Tribal Africa had the same characteristics, with this exception that the aristocratic monarchic factor was almost totally absent. Clanic collectivism was proletarian. Justice was also more eminent within the clan. The repressive political apparatus had become less crushing, without, however, reaching the same degree of withering away as in the tribes and clans conceived by Engels. Such data bespeak an original type of development. Origin of the constitutional regime. In analyzing the significance of royalty, we reviewed the cases of traditional kings, Islamized kings, and emigrant non Islamized kings. We also analyzed the content of the constitutions. The time has come to suggest what may have brought these about. Many facts would lead us to feel that at the beginning, royal power, being sacrosanct, was absolute. The generally accepted idea of African royalty does not allow for supposing that at the very start its authority might have been limited by some kind of constitutional system. On the other hand, it is not conceivable that this authority might have been exercised in an abusive manner, considering its religious character. But within the royal court, design and spontaneity both playing a part, everyone began to serve within the framework of his own profession. A tradition was born, grew stronger, and finally took root with the ideas that the warrior nobility, linked to the development of the monarchy, had toward manual labor. The latter was rather despised, as against the military calling. It would therefore not have been possible at the start for a prince within the framework of life at court to be assigned work of a manual character. The equerry, the executioner, the head ostler, the guardian of the treasury, and so on, could not be noblemen. For the nobles, when not fighting, indulged their idleness or played at sports. games of skill and courage, hunting, or yote, a local chess game involving strategy. These first professionals by caste were the forerunners of the future government ministers whose functions, considering the emoluments involved, quickly became hereditary. By this natural mechanism, it worked out as if each caste from the start had been called upon to designate its own representative of court. No such thing. The system was not born out of idealism. Only a deceptive appearance can lead to such conceptions. It grew out of the local reality based upon the caste system, the division of labor. But as time went by, the council so constituted was to take on importance by the very dialectic of social relationships. No text, no tradition forced the king to take its advice. He did it first voluntarily in order to rule more wisely. Then he was forced more and more to do so by the effect of an internal social necessity. The freemen in particular, the grandees of the kingdom, represented by the prime minister, soon made their weight felt, discreetly but effectively limiting the power of the king. In reality, this limitation everywhere extended only to the stopping of abuses. The prime minister was the one who could initiate the procedure which, in Cayor for instance, would lead to the deposing of the king, if the latter disagreed with him, that is, with the people, if in fact he ceased to rule wisely. This way of conceiving the genesis of monarchical constitutions is confirmed by tradition within the courts of African marabouts. Members of the masses, often on their own initiative, without having been specifically designated as at the courts of temporal leaders, carry out activities related to their professions. If this proves satisfactory, they are after a while duly appointed, confirmed in their positions, without this, however, assuming any hereditary family character. That is how it happened with Amadou Bamba, the founder of Mouridism in Senegal, with his brother Cheikh Anta, with Sheikh Ibrahima Fall during the past 50 years. The identity of appearances of the lives of temporal and spiritual leaders was not without its drawbacks for the latter. The French government often thought that hidden behind the religious facade were temporal ambitions for power. As a result, Amadou Bamba was deported to Gabon for 7 years, and Sheikh Anta to the Sudan, to Senegal, from where he returned only in 1935 after intervention of the deputy Galandou Diop. Fustel de Coulanges is quite correct in warning historical researchers against the error of imagining the past in terms of the present. But all the earlier developments relating to the stability of African societies show that the danger of intellectual adventures is negligible in this case. Crowning of the king and court life. To the extent that African history up to now has been confined to a monotonous succession of dates and events dryly related, it has seemed important to us to try to picture the local color of the past with maximum intensity, relying nevertheless very closely on available documentation. Songhai. In the present state of research, we know practically nothing of the enthronement rites of the Magha of Ghana. On the other hand, we can trace the details of this ritual for Songhai. The Askia had a throne in the form of a dais, perhaps inspired by those of the Orient. However that may be, there is no doubt of its existence. When the Askia Musa's brothers formed a coalition to fight and kill him, they all quickly returned to seize the throne. The Shah Farma Alu found the Cormina Fari already on the throne. A short bloody fight ensued, resulting in the death of Alu and the accession of the Cormina Fari, who was none other than Mohammed Benkan. He thus owed his accession to the vigilant support of his brother, Othman Tenfiran. During the coronation ceremony, a whole group of people, all equally wearing the burnous, surrounded the king right into the throne room in solemn procession. They were the Summa, among whom Amar, when pursued by Benkan's sons, had hidden away in disguise, dressing like them in a burnous. The enthronement was followed by the swearing of oaths. Generals, soldiers, all the people, even the clergy, had to swear on the Quran an oath of faithfulness and obedience to the new Askia. It even seems that this ceremony was more important than the actual enthronement, because it obligatory took place for each new reign, whereas it was not rare for the Askia to be invested with power in some small outlying city where in all likelihood there was no throne at all. The king had to be present at the Friday prayer which was said in his name. There are some indications that this oath was not purely a matter of form, and that the masses of people, to the extent that they were fervent believers, truly felt themselves bound by it. Indeed, the Askia Ismail believed that the hemorrhage which struck him on his ascension was due to the fact that he had not respected the oath of faithfulness he had sworn on the Quran to his brother, Askia Benkan. The royal audiences in Songhai were strictly regulated. Every high dignitary had a set place in the assembly, corresponding to his official role, even also had its distinctive uniform and insignia. Following the death of the Dendi Fari Sinbalo, Askia Daud gave that title to the Khoi Kamkoli, but he had him take the insignia off his uniform and allowed him to wear only the official headdress during receptions. We must deduce from this that his appointment was not permanent. During the audience, shortly thereafter, the Askia claimed to have consulted the Almighty in order to find out whom he should name to lead the people of Dendi, and appointed Ali Dudo, who had presumably received the divine approval. In the assembly then sitting before the king, Kamkoli was in the place of the Dendi Fari. He politely but firmly and with dignity took note of the hypocrisy of Askia Daud, then left the Farai's place to take that of the Khoi. Of course, the king had even more insignia and emblems which were duly removed from him if he was deposed by a coup d'etat, which is what happened to Askia Ishak. Askia Muhammad received from the Abbasid Caliph Mulay Abbas a turban, a green skull cap, and a saber to wear around the neck. Since he inaugurated the reign of the Askias, these objects were thereafter added to the royal insignia, which already included a royal drum, 12 standards, and the aforementioned 10 Tori, which made the Askia master of the earth. The emperor of Ghana, in addition to his crown, which was more like a diadem, had several banners and a single flag, according to Idrisi. The Faraj uniform must have included a double-tailed tunic and a turban. After the death of Faraj Abdallah, this was the outfit, apparently corresponding to his functions, that Askia Musa gave to his brother Ishak, the farmer, at least of certain regions, was entitled to a drum. When in 1524 the Adiki farmer Bella, Askia Muhammad's nephew, was named Binka farmer, he became entitled to a drum, of which all his other brothers were envious. The Tariq-es-Sudan notes that the position thus held in the governmental hierarchy was a very high one. When his brothers threatened to smash his drum the day he came to Cayor, Bella had a very African reaction of defiance. The ceremonial of court life was very strict. It seems, give or take a few variants, to have been the same throughout Black Africa. On approaching the king, one had to cover one's head with dust as a sign of humility. The chief in Africa is by definition the one who must not raise his voice. His rank and dignity require him to speak very softly, whether he be a spiritual or a temporal leader. Thus, the Mansa of Mali, like the Askia and present-day Marabouts, all had their heralds who audibly transmitted to the assembly the words of the chief. The herald in Songhai was called the Wanado. Listening to the orders of the king, even when he was not present, one had to remain standing, provided one had recognized his authority. This was how Atsman had to act toward Askia Musa when he finally temporarily recognized his authority after having been lectured by his mother. Obviously, one also bared one's head in the presence of the king. In traditional African monarchies, the king alone wore a headdress in early times, as was the case with the Pharaoh of Egypt. Even the heir apparent of Ghana, the emperor's nephew, wore nothing on his head in his presence. Askia Benken was the one who embellished life at the court of Songhai. The prince maintained the royalty in the most remarkable way. He heightened it, embellished it, and adorned his court with more numerous courtiers than before, dressed in more sumptuous outfits. He increased the number of orchestras and singers of both sexes and lavished more favors and gifts. During his reign, prosperity spread throughout his empire, and an era of wealth began to be established. According to Kati, Benken had cloth clothes made for himself, decked his servants with bracelets of precious metals, and went accompanied by drummers and canoes. He introduced the trumpet, fotarifo, and the deep-toned drum, gabtanda, before him. These two instruments had been the exclusive possession of the king of Cayor. Silk bedding was customarily used. As can be seen from the following, the luxury of Songhai went into real decline as compared to Ghana and Mali. This would explain the disappointment of Judair and Leo Africanus on their arrival at Cayuga. The court music was polyphonic, like the music of the griots and the Moorids of today. On the other hand, there was the main singer, Debekat and Wolof, and the choir, Avukat, which might vary in composition. At the courts of temporal chiefs, the singers were of different sexes, but at those of the Marabouts they could be only male. In 1706, before the time of the Askias, the insignia of the king of Cayuga, according to al-Bakri, were made up of a seal, a sword, and a Quran, all of which was said to have been sent by the Umayyad sovereign of Spain. The dynasty having already become Islamized, the king was always a Muslim. Cayor at the time was made up of two cities, the king's and a Muslim quarter. The king was then called the Khanda, which is reminiscent of Nubia. The people dressed in a loincloth and a jacket of skin or other material, the quality of which depended on the individual's means. They had not yet become Islamized and followed the traditional beliefs. While the king took his meals, a drum was beaten, all urban activity stopped, and black dancing women in wigs portrayed dance scenes around him. At the end of the meal, its remains were thrown into a river. A different drum beat informed the city, which resumed its activity, and the courtiers who were present shouted and exclaimed with joy. Such was the local color of life at the court in the period of the Khandas, according to al-Bakri. Cayor, the enthronement of the Damel of Cayor, except for the secret religious side of it, was rather rudimentary. People foregathered, made a huge pile of sand in this flat country, atop which the king went to be enthroned, comparably in this to a Frankish king being raised on a shield. It was his elevation above the others, his exalted rank, that was thus made tangible by the building of a throne of sand. His distinctive insignia was a circular gree on the left ankle and Dambo's tank. Originally, it would seem to have been a ring, Lamu tank, whence Laman, the heir, the landed owner, and Serer and Lam Toro, the heir to the Toro and Tukulor, under Damel Meka Tenda of Cayor, whose reign was a happy one. The temporary capital of Makkah was lighted by jars of fat in which dipped a narrow strip of material to serve as a wick. They were placed at every street corner. Ghana. In Ghana, the luxury evident at court, as the documents allow us to reconstitute it in detail, was equaled only by that of the Aegean period. The emperor, his heir apparent, the notables, all literally dripped with gold. The pages, horses, and dogs of the Tunkara were equally covered with it. People were literally living in gold, as is shown by an al-Bakri passage about the audiences of the king, who was called both Tunkara and Kaya Magan. According to him, only the king and his sister's son, that is, the nephew who is heir apparent, were allowed to wear tailored clothes. All others, following the same religion as the Tunkara, i.e., the tradition, wore loincloths of cotton, silk, or brocade according to their means. The men were clean shaven, and the women shaved their heads. The king's headpiece was made up of several gold caps, wrapped in very delicate cotton materials. When he held an audience for the people to hear their grievances and remedy them, he sat on a throne inside a pavilion, around which stood 10 horses, caparisoned in gold materials. Behind him stood 10 pages, carrying shields and swords, mounted in gold. The sons of the princes of his empire stood to his right, dressed in magnificent clothes, their braided hair intertwined with gold threads. The governor of the city sat on the ground before the king, and all about were the viziers, that is, his ministers, in the same position. The door of the pavilion was guarded by dogs of excellent breed, who almost never left the king's side. They wore gold and silver collars, from which dangled bells of the same materials. The sound of a drum, deba, made of a hollow piece of wood, announced the opening of the session. The people came running, clapping hands, poured dust over their heads, and presented their grievances. Through the description of one of the emperor's audiences, we get an idea of how both the Tunkara and his retinue were dressed, the insignia they wore, how the pages were armed, the women coiffed, and so on. Alongside these audiences, or royal sessions of justice, which were common to Ghana, Maasai, Malay, and Songhai, there were no less general horseback rides through the capital. The Tunkara, like the Moro Naba, rode on horseback, followed by his entire court, through the various neighborhoods of the city, also to hear his subjects' grievances and remedy them. That, by and large, was the court ceremonial of Ghana, as the documents allow us to reconstitute it. We must add that the emperor, according to al-Bakri, lived in a stone castle surrounded by a wall. Idrisi is even more precise. According to him, the emperor lived in a fortified chateau built in 1116, decorated with sculptures and paintings and boasting glass windows. Understandably, De La Fosse was reluctant to accept that text too literally. Idrisi wrote in 1150. He was one of the best Arab geographers of his time. In Sicily, he drew up the first navigational charts that were to be used in modern times. Nevertheless, it is customary to point out that in his description of Spain and Africa, he relates facts about this continent on which he was not as well informed as al-Bakri. However that may be, it is hard to believe that so scrupulous and thoughtful a geographer would invent out of a whole cloth such precise details in describing the chateau. Malay. Ibn Battuta, who visited Mali in 1351 to 1353 under Mansa Soliman, left testimony which allows us to recreate the local color of the royal audiences. On audience days, the emperor sat in an alcove that had a door leading into the palace. It had 3 windows made of wood covered in silver foil, and below 3 others decked with gold plate or royal, which leads us to conclude that the palace had at least 2 stories. These windows had curtains. A handkerchief with Egyptian designs attached to a silken cord was slipped through the grillwork that protected them on audience days. The people were summoned by horns and drums. 300 soldiers carrying bows and javelins lined up in double columns on either side of the window in which the emperor was to be. Those with the javelins were on the outside and standing, while those with the bows sat in front of them, the 4 columns facing each other. 2 saddled, bridled horses and 2 rams were brought in, a custom reminiscent of Ghana. Nearly 300 subjects went looking for Kanja Musa. The Ferraris, the emirs, the preacher, Khatib, and the jurist arrived and took seats to the right and left in front of the soldiers, in the space between their columns. Doga, the herald, stood at the door, wearing Zerdkanen clothes. On his head, a fringed turban, typical of the country. He alone had the privilege of wearing boots on this day. He had a sword and a gold scabbard on his side, and he wore spurs, 2 gold and silver javelins with iron tips. Soldiers, bureaucrats, pages, Mesophites, and all others remained outside in a wide tree-lined street. Each of the Ferraris was preceded by his subordinates, carrying blades, bowls, drums, and horns made of elephant's tusk. One of the musical instruments was the balafon, which was made of reeds and gourds and was played with drumsticks. Each Ferrari had a quiver of arrows at his back and a bow in his hand. He was mounted, and his subordinates, both foot and horse, stood in front of him. When the emperor arrived behind the window, Dugha served as mouthpiece, transmitting the orders, recovering the grievances, and submitting them to the sovereign, who gave his decisions. Sometimes the audience was held inside the palace courtyard. Then a silk-covered seat, mounted on three tiers, was placed under a tree. This throne was called Benbi. A cushion was placed on it, and the whole thing covered by a dome-shaped silken parasol, with a golden bird at the top, as large as a hawk. The Manka came out of the palace with a bow in his hand, a quiver on his back. He wore a turban of gold cloth bound by golden ribbons, ending in metal tips, more than a palm in length, looking like daggers. He wore a red coat of European material, the Montanfis. Singers walked before him, holding in their hands gold and silver vessels. He walked forward slowly, followed closely by 300 armed soldiers, and stopped from time to time. Before taking his place on the seat, he would make a slow turn around. Then the horns, the trumpets, and the drums sounded as soon as he was seated. Once again, the two horses and the ram were brought to drive away bad luck. Dugha was at his habitual place near the Manka. The rest of the people were on the outside. The Ferraris were called in, and the session began in the usual conditions, as in Ghana. When, in October 1559, Askia Daoud defeated the Manka of Mali at the Battle of Dibi Karala, he married his daughter Nara. She then lived in a luxury comparable to that of Helen of Troy. She was covered with jewels, surrounded by numerous slaves, both male and female, and abundantly supplied with furniture and baggage. All of her household utensils were made of gold: dishes, jars, mortars, pestles, and so on. Obviously, an illustration of African history is possible. There are more documents than generally stated. They allow us to reconstitute, sometimes even in detail, over a period of almost 2,000 years, African political and social life. We know how the members of the different classes in Ghana, Malai, Maasai, Songhai, and Cayor were dressed, what they did with their spare time, their daily routines, and so on. We know what social relationships governed society, and thus the behavior of an entire society, which we can vividly bring back to life before our eyes, even on the stage or in films. The local color would be authentic. This description of the different aspects of African life will be fleshed out in succeeding chapters by the addition of facts no less abundant or detailed concerning the administrative, judicial, and military administration, as well as the intellectual life, and so on. In the course of these developments, we will be able better to see the convergences and divergences between them and the European societies contemporaneous with the period under consideration. End of chapter 4.